Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover how we can use the stimulus to fatigue ratio to maximize muscle growth. First, let's cover exactly what the stimulus to fatigue ratio is. This is a theoretical concept comparing the hypertrophic stimulus of a training modality to the fatigue it induces. All forms of training induce some sort of hypertrophic stimulus and has a fatigue cost too. Ideally, we want our training to have the best stimulus to fatigue ratio, meaning the best hypertrophic stimulus and the lowest fatigue cost. Now let's cover in more detail what exactly stimulus and fatigue means. First, let's explore the stimulus side of the ratio. This essentially refers to the raw hypertrophic stimulus induced by a training session. Clearly, a greater stimulus will result in a greater hypertrophy response. This will result in superior muscle growth over time, with all other factors being equal. The hypertrophic stimulus can't really be quantified directly, which makes it difficult to assess. Rather, our best options are to use indirect indicators, which may provide a general gauge of how effective a training session was. We have 4 primary indicators of hypertrophy, which can be used to assess the stimulus. First is the mind-muscle connection. This refers to the feeling of muscle contraction and activation while performing an exercise. Ideally, we want to target the stress of an exercise to a specific muscle group, and if we feel a strong mind-muscle connection, that's a good indicator that that particular muscle is being trained. Second is the muscle pump. This refers to the feeling of swelling and fullness in a muscle immediately after it has been trained. Usually the pump is more pronounced after high rep sets or metabolite techniques. Third is muscle soreness. This refers to the soreness and tenderness we feel the following days after training a particular muscle group. If we feel slightly sore in a muscle group the following day after we have trained it, then this is probably a good sign that there was some disruption to homeostasis and the session was somewhat effective. It should also be noted that soreness is usually exacerbated when performing novel exercise, so it should only really be used in the context of resistance training. And lastly, we have lifting performance. This is more of a chronic indicator of hypertrophy rather than an acute indicator. While strength is not directly correlated with muscle growth, gradual improvements in rep performance and load lifted over time can be a good indicator that you're making gains over time. It should be understood that it is unlikely for all of these indicators to be present with every single exercise and every single training session. However, the more of these indicators we experience on a regular basis, the more likely it is that we are providing a good hypertrophic stimulus. So the stimulus side of the equation is fairly straightforward. It simply refers to the hypertrophic stimulus of training. The fatigue side of the ratio, however, is a little bit more nuanced. There are 2 aspects to fatigue, which we will now cover. First is joint stress. This refers to localized fatigue on the relevant joints and connective tissue involved in the exercise. All exercises induce some level of joint stress, and there is a finite amount of stress each joint can handle before it becomes irritated and results in a pain response. Therefore, we want to minimize joint stress during training so that our volume isn't limited by joint or connective tissue pain. And the other relevant form of fatigue is systemic fatigue. Systemic fatigue is not a well-defined phenomenon, but it can be generally described as the overall fatigue of the entire organism. This is non-specific to resistance training, meaning it is affected by all forms of exercise and all forms of stress outside of exercise and affects all bodily systems. Once again, there is only a finite amount of stress we can handle before breaching our systemic capacity. Breaching our systemic capacity usually results in feelings of lethargy, disrupted sleep, an increased risk of illness, and a decrease in lifting performance. Therefore, we want to minimize systemic fatigue while preserving the hypertrophic stimulus. Now that we understand what the stimulus to fatigue ratio is, the question now becomes, why should we even consider this concept for hypertrophy training? Why should we care about this ratio? Shouldn't we only be concerned with a hypertrophic stimulus? Well, unfortunately, we all have a limit to how much volume we can handle throughout the week. We know that volume is a primary driver of hypertrophy, so we ideally want to be able to tolerate higher training volumes to promote muscle hypertrophy. If the fatigue cost of training is too high, then we won't be able to train with as much volume compared with a lower fatigue approach. So if we improve the stimulus to fatigue ratio of our training, we will either be able to tolerate higher training volumes or get a better stimulus with the current volumes we are training with. So yes, we always want to provide the most hypertrophic stimulus possible, but we also want to minimize unnecessary fatigue so that we can train with sufficient volume to maximize hypertrophy. Now that we have a more detailed understanding of what the stimulus to fatigue ratio is, let's now cover what training variables influence this ratio. The first variable is exercise selection. The exercises we implement to train a particular muscle group can influence the hypertrophic stimulus and fatigue induced. Some exercises are naturally more stimulative than others, and some are more fatiguing than others. Generally, exercises which train the target muscle through a large range of motion and provide significant tension throughout the entire range are going to provide a good hypertrophic stimulus. On the other hand, some exercises naturally seem to irritate a lifter's joints more than others. This is highly individual to each lifter based on anatomical structure and injury history. Furthermore, some exercises are naturally more systemically fatiguing than others. Generally, compound lifts which allow heavy loads to be lifted and those which involve many accessory and stabilizer muscles are more systemically fatiguing. On the other hand, isolation lifts which have low stability demands and involve less overall musculature are generally less systemically fatiguing. Next, we have rep ranges and loads. For hypertrophy training, the majority of our sets will be somewhere within the 6 to 20 rep range. As we now know, training anywhere within this range can achieve equal hypertrophy outcomes when sets are taken close to failure. So the hypertrophic stimulus isn't really going to be impacted by the rep ranges and loads we use within this general range. Furthermore, because we aren't training with very heavy loads for hypertrophy, like we would be if we were training for strength, the fatigue cost of training with different rep ranges and loads within this range is also not that significant. However, if we perform too much training with heavier loads within this range, around the 6 to 10 rep range, it may be slightly more stressful on the joints compared with training in the 10 to 20 range. Furthermore, the systemic fatigue cost is likely to be essentially equivalent within the hypertrophy rep ranges. Similar to joint stress, the systemic fatigue cost may be slightly greater when training with less than 10 reps. Another variable which will influence the stimulus to fatigue ratio is lifting technique. Our technique can influence the hypertrophic stimulus of the lift and the fatigue it induces. Generally, lifting with a full range of motion, controlled eccentric tempo, and in a way that maximizes stress on the target muscle will result in a superior hypertrophic stimulus. Furthermore, lifting with a partial range of motion, an uncontrolled eccentric tempo, and lifting to maximize load lifted rather than to stress the muscle will result in greater joint stress and greater systemic fatigue. This is because it will allow the trainee to lift heavier loads without necessarily improving the hypertrophic stimulus. And the last training variable influencing the stimulus to fatigue ratio is how close we train to failure. It seems that training to failure seems to provide a similar hypertrophy response compared with training a few reps before failure. Training to failure seems to be slightly more hypertrophic per set, although the difference in stimulus is not all that significant. Joint stress is also probably not significantly different either when training to failure versus stopping a set a few reps before failure, assuming we are training within the hypertrophy rep ranges. However, systemic fatigue is impacted more by proximity to failure. It is theorized that as we train closer to failure, it seems to be exponentially more systemically fatiguing. So despite the hypertrophic stimulus being very similar when training to failure versus leaving 1 to 2 reps in reserve, systemic fatigue is much greater when training to failure. So to summarize, let's establish how we can maximize the stimulus to fatigue ratio for hypertrophy training. There is no exact method for this, rather the principle should be used to make informed decisions. However, here are some general recommendations to maximize the hypertrophic stimulus and minimize the fatigue cost of training. First, we should select exercises which provide a good stimulus for us as an individual and avoid those which seem to irritate our joints or connective tissue. It may also be wise to implement a balance of both compound and isolation lifts to ensure we get a good hypertrophic stimulus for all muscle groups without excessive fatigue. While rep ranges and loads aren't really going to impact the stimulus or fatigue cost to any significant extent, we probably do want to avoid training in the 6 to 10 rep range for all sets of our training routine. it may be wise to implement a variety of different rep ranges and loads within the hypertrophy range to ensure the joints aren't experiencing too much local stress. In terms of technique, trainees should try to lift in a way that maximizes stress on the target muscle, not the technique which allows them to lift the heaviest load. This will ensure the target muscle is a limiting factor of each set, while reducing joint stress and systemic fatigue. And lastly, we should probably be sparing with how frequently we train to failure. The stimulus of training with a few reps in the tank is almost equivalent to training to complete failure, although the systemic fatigue cost of training to failure is far greater. Therefore, it's probably wise for trainees to perform the majority of their training with 1 to 3 reps in reserve on average, and only some sets taken to true muscular failure. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.